Good afternoon. This is Heather, and I'm here to talk about my question for the annotated bibliography project, which was, what are effective strategies for teaching middle school ELLs academic vocabulary? And I actually began looking in general at the teach strategies for academic vocabulary acquisition, and I found there was a lot of research for elementary, but sort of a much more reduced number of studies done on middle schoolers, and that is the age I teach and really my passion. So given I think that middle schoolers have really distinct needs, both socially, emotionally, and academically, I decided to focus on that area. Also because I think standardized testing becomes more high stakes, and that research has shown that especially at this age group, we do see that ELLs and low-level readers tend to struggle when it comes to standardized testing and often show poor performance in school. And I think because of their need to fit in with their peers, sometimes some apathy, right, that develops at this age, especially academically, and some confidence issues they can have with all that's going on at their age, we don't tend to always know. They don't tend to tell us when they're struggling. And we know that reading is crucial, and reading levels up and increase in difficulty at this age, but it's not also enough to just have a text for them to acquire academic vocabulary. We need to give them strategies. So what is there to be done? Most of the studies I looked at talked about implementing vocabulary improvement programs or enrichment programs to see if this made a difference. Some important factors they mentioned to consider when designing these programs were: one, we know students come to school with different learning experiences, different cultural experiences, sometimes minimal opportunities to even learn to read and acquire academic vocabulary in their own language. That can obviously affect how they do in their second language learning. Also, how closely related is their first language to this second language they're acquiring? And remembering that middle schoolers can fool us, right? They've often at this age, especially if they've been in schools learning, acquired enough general vocabulary, enough conversation skills that we think they should be at a higher academic level than they really are when you look at their academic vocabulary, right? Their basic interpersonal communication skills could be really strong, and their cognitive academic language proficiency, not so much. We know because that takes time. A lot of the studies I looked at said that it takes between 5 and 10 years of input, of immersion, to really acquire academic vocabulary. I'm still learning academic vocabulary at my age, right? In this course, the amount of academic vocabulary we've been asked to learn in our first language is challenging, right? And when you get to middle school, there's also a shift in model. They tend to have multiple teachers focused on their content areas, not as much unification necessarily in how this is all taught to them because of all these players. And that also leads to limited instructional time per content area with all the changing in classes and different instructors. And also, they're often taught their academic vocabulary in the content area without visuals, which is hugely challenging. So a few techniques that could be helpful that I saw in the studies I looked at. One, we must shelter vocabulary. Introducing this academic vocabulary 3 or 4 terms at a time is much more useful. And with that introduction, give them visuals, lots of visuals, large cards, word walls, which is something I implement in my classroom and have seen hugely helpful in improving reading comprehension and writing skills. They have words for academic writing, conjunctions, words for storytelling, just all of these visuals that they can access at all times to support that tier 2 vocabulary. A print-rich environment is really big for middle schoolers. Also, there should be direct instruction of terms, but then it should be put in context, multiple contexts for kids to see and relate to the words. That context should be meaningful. Personalize it to our students' interests as much as we can. Create discussions using this vocabulary. Also, student choice. One of the studies I looked at talked about giving kids cards, word cards, with a term and a definition and mixing them up, and then having students find a partner who had their, other half, and then giving those students the choice to either demonstrate it in a sentence, draw a visual to show comprehension, or put it in a little skit, giving them some ownership of their learning. And games is another good way to up their motivation and their involvement. We know middle schoolers especially, I mean, all kids love games. And interaction and socialization should be a part of the techniques we use, because we know peer interaction, especially at the adolescent level, is takes precedence over all things. So if we can include that in our instruction, all the better. So what are some specific activity ideas we can use to help the acquisition of academic vocabulary? A couple of my studies related to games. One was more table or interactive game based, and one was more video game based. So for interactive games, we can use games styled after Taboo, Pictionary, dice games, Jeopardy style games, which I use in class all the time and the kids love. It encourages teamwork. It helps them with making decisions about how to represent and explain the words we're giving them. You can play music puzzlers, where you kind of relate music to the vocabulary, or like a, musical chairs kind of game, right? A gallery walk, where they can see the words either in a story that they have to piece all together, or pictures from a story and they have to use the academic vocabulary in conjunction with that, gives them a way to personalize the meaning and remember it, hopefully, a little bit more in that context. Video games, obviously, especially in this day and age, plays right into the competitive nature of middle schoolers, which I can tell you is very strong. And studies also found that kids learned equally as well in this academic vocabulary put in a video game based model as they did in traditional lessons. So not necessarily more, but equal seems like a way to kind of mix up the lessons. When pre-teaching vocab, we should use cognates where possible. And sometimes even just if you're in a real challenging situation where kids are stuck, if you can find a way to use their native language, even briefly. One of the studies is related to the acquisition of math vocabulary mentioned that being helpful. And I personally am a firm believer in using movement, keep them active, and gestures. And I just came off a week-long conference where I took Russian. We were required to take a language we were unfamiliar with, to have that real experience for a week of what it feels like to be immersed in a language you don't know. Russian was certainly far from any, knowledge base I have. But I can tell you now, I remember the words we gestured. Lubit, love, bijit, run, idiot is walk. So these aren't academic vocabulary words per se, because I was a very, very novice. But associating gestures with vocabulary can be very helpful. And obviously teaching high frequency academic vocabulary first. Journaling is another good idea, because that can personalize it for kids. Find a way to use so many terms, in a journal, or one term per journal entry. And also we need to teach language functions that they're going to need for classes, like compare and contrast. Teach that in a familiar context first, and then scaffold it up to teaching it with the content related words. One of the studies I read focused on picture books and how that can be helpful at all ages, but especially at the middle school age, because there's actually some strong academic vocabulary in picture books, and we have then the visuals to support it. Another idea I liked was reading aloud from a high interest novel as a hook, right? So that students kind of get interested. And then you can, a high interest novel that also is comprehensible, of course, that then you can let students choose one to take home and encourage that, independent reading as well. So what were the results of the studies? On average, students did show improvement in their academic vocabulary, but they did not necessarily show any increase or improvement in general vocabulary. Reading comprehension also seemed to benefit, but studies of course mentioned that there are factors that we are not able to control that can affect the results, such as student attendance, because a lot of these were after school programs. What their first language was could affect the results one child to the next, and how much experience, of course, they had with academic vocabulary in their first language. But in general, it seems that these programs are helpful and they're necessary as academic vocabulary becomes more abstract and challenging at the middle school years. And that really we should be seeing an increase in research and the implementation of these instructional efforts with middle schoolers. Something that I read that I thought just sort of summarized my findings was that students will best learn words in a rich verbal environment with direct instruction of the target words, seen in multiple contexts with an opportunity to personalize the words and to actively process their meaning. Thank you very much.